I'm Tracy Figueroa. I'm an attorney at Texas RioGrande Legal Aid, and I'm the Disaster Assistance Group Coordinator. And I've helped our organization respond to disasters for almost 16 years. We're actually starting our 16th Federal Disaster Declaration response now. So Sequence Happens is to explain the many different kinds of disaster-related legal needs that arise out of a disaster. Many people know there's lots of problems that come up after an event like that, but don't realize that there's legal solutions available to many of them. As lawyers, we can spot those different needs. There's also many of them that overlap with each other. If you have a landlord who's not making repairs, then you may have somebody who's going to get behind on rent and then need assistance from FEMA and have problems with both of those different entities. We also have these things snowball. One legal setback can lead to others. It's also important to understand that they come in different phases. We define them in this session as short-term, things that come up within a week or two of the disaster, mid-term, maybe a month out to about 6 months, and then long-term, things that could even start early on but can go on for years. There's, I guess, two big ways I'd kind of divide that up. By direct services, being able to help an individual client sort through an issue with their landlord or represent them in a FEMA case, to go back to the original examples, or to help them with a situation with a contractor. And then also bigger scale advocacy. By working on a variety of different cases and a high volume of them, we're able to kind of spot trends or obstacles that encumber people who are seeking assistance. And so looking at that on a systemic level and working on impact work, whether it be trying to change policy or whether it involves litigation. I think some of it is being flexible and being able to call on a variety of skills that lawyers would have. You know, certainly you want to be ready to litigate if that's called for, but you want to be able to negotiate and try to avoid having to go to court if you can resolve a situation more simply. Knowing when to use the media to shine light on a situation in order to resolve it. I think empathy and being able to do a really good client interview are important because these issues do overlap. A client might frame their issue one way because that's what's most urgent to them right then, but a lawyer looking at this may pull different details out of the situation and spot several different legal issues that need to be resolved in order to set them on the road to recovery. Important types of resources we pull from would be our partnerships at a community level, state level, national level, within the legal community and outside the legal community. So locally, we work very closely with voluntary organizations active in disaster and different coalitions of organizations that work on disaster relief generally. There's also typically long-term recovery groups that are formed, and they may receive donations, be able to provide financial assistance to our clients, or have volunteers coming into town that are able to help with construction or cleaning out homes. And so just knowing what those resources are, and then we are able to complement that by providing the legal solutions to some of the issues that their clients are needing. As far as a state level, we work very closely with other people in the legal community that are involved in disaster relief work, including our LSC-funded organization counterparts in the state and the state bar and volunteer lawyers projects and our bar associations. On a national level, we partner closely with the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division, especially as part of FEMA's Disaster Legal Services program, and the Legal Services Corporation keeps their organizations working together and informed about developments, so we don't all have to reinvent the wheel when a disaster happens in our community. Another good resource is the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and they've also got a network of people that are involved in disaster recovery and housing issues generally. And so just keeping each other informed helps us all be more effective advocates for our clients with whatever we're working on. A lot of these groups also have different resources available on their websites that are really helpful for people. And then I've learned over the years there's different alerts, Google alerts for disaster, and just watching the Federal Register for developments with the different agencies involved in that helps us stay informed. It helps a lot to be prepared and to know some about this ahead of time, because sooner or later many of our communities are going to be affected by disaster, and you don't want to be learning all of this after the event. We've all had to do it, but it makes things much harder, and you can be a more effective advocate if you learn it up front and just understand disasters are going to happen again. They seem to be becoming more frequent and more intense, so it's just good information we should all know.
So on a point of personal privilege, I just want to tell you all how extraordinarily exciting and inspiring it is to meet all of you. If we added up the number of federally declared disasters that these 4 panelists have, it would probably be upwards of 20-something. So we are so grateful that they said yes to this introductory session called Sequence Happens, which is to really raise awareness about the seasons of needs that arise for during disaster recovery, that there are short-term needs, legal needs that arise almost immediately, and then there's medium-range needs and long-term legal issues that arise, and that all of that's going to play into how you conduct your individual work and as a cohort. And is why we organize the panel in that way, and there's 3 chunks. So we are thrilled to have Saundra Brown from Lone Star Legal Aid, Cindy Huddleston from Florida Legal Services, Tracy Figueroa from Texas RioGrande, and Madison Sloan from Texas Appleseed. So we're going to start with the short term, right? So Cindy, please get us started.
Hello. I'm here with the panel to talk about the sequence of legal needs after disaster. And we're going to kind of divide it up into 3 different portions. The first is to talk about the short-term legal needs that you'll see almost immediately after a disaster. The midterm, which is probably it would be within 1 to 6 months, maybe up to a year. And then some of the longer-term legal problems that you're going to see. And those can be happening up to a year after or even more, because these events do tend to have an effect on households for a long time, depending on what has occurred in their home. So let me say first that I know this is about post-disaster legal needs, but I want to talk just a few minutes about how vital it is for you to do some groundwork now in advance of the disaster so that your post-disaster legal work will be a lot easier for you. First, you need to develop a relationship with your local emergency management. In our experience in the world of emergency management, in many states, response and recovery is a grounds-up effort. The state and the federal officials are going to be looking to your local communities. I don't know if you have counties, parishes, whatever the subdivision is called. They're going to be looking to them to tell them what the legal needs are, what the needs of the community are, legal and otherwise. So it's important that you get to know these folks because they hold a lot of power when a disaster happens, and you want to get to know them now because after the disaster happens, they're going to be too busy to talk to you. They're going to be, people are going to be coming at them from all sides, and you're just going to be one nameless face. You want to get to know them now and develop a relationship with them. Does your county or your parish, or whatever the division is in your state, does it have its own emergency management plan? I know many states do require emergency management plans of their counties and their parishes. You need to get that. You need to see what it says. Look to see what the strengths and the weaknesses are in that plan and how it impacts low-income families. And if you think it's deficient, now is the time to start advocating with your local officials to get changes made into that plan. See what your nursing homes and other institutions or facilities that serve persons with disabilities, the elderly, persons with special needs, see what they plan to do in response to a disaster. I know this was a huge problem after Katrina. Everyone probably remembers the terrible incident with the nursing homes after Katrina where many people died. This has happened in Florida also. Florida is not unlike many of other states which do require that facilities that have a duty to take care of people with special needs have an emergency management plan that tells the state, that tells residents and their families how the institution plans to respond in the event that they lose power, in the event that they're flooded, in the event that they have to evacuate their residents. That's something you need to look at. And again, the reason for doing that is to know what's supposed to be happening and to identify strengths and weaknesses and try to get those fixed in advance of whatever disaster may occur in your state or your community. we suggest that you talk to your local Red Cross. In Florida, the Red Cross is the organization that manages the shelters throughout the states with an agreement with particular counties. Are they the ones who have an agreement in your state to manage shelters? You need to know that. You need to develop a relationship with them. That relationship can get you in the door to talk to people who are residents of the shelter if need be. You also want to see what that shelter plan looks like. How are they going to deal with people who are sexual offenders? How are they going to deal with felons? These are things that you need to know before disaster strikes. What facilities are ADA compliant? Hopefully they all are. What facilities take pets? A lot of your clients are going to be reluctant to leave their homes, as you know, if they have a dog or family, a dog or cat who's a family member to them. You need to look up your state volunteer organization active in disaster. It's called VOAD, and consider joining. I can tell you that joining my state, Florida, the Florida VOAD, was one of the single most important things that I did when I started disaster work. That's because it brings together so many different organizations, both governmental and nonprofit, in responding and recovering to a disaster. And it offers you kind of an instant relationship, an instant conduit to officials that you would not normally have. In Florida, FEMA appoints a representative who sits on your state VOAD council just like anyone else. They're on phone calls, they're in meetings, they're actually at your beck and call if you have a question about a disaster recovery center or about a shelter. They provide a lot of access and information that otherwise would take you weeks or months if you were ever able to get it all. They could provide it to you instantly. And they, at least in Florida, I can tell you that they're very responsive to us, the state and federal officials who are assigned to deal with VOAD members. So I really recommend that you look into that for your state. Hopefully your state's VOAD is as active and important as Florida's is. Does your state have a registry of persons with for persons with disabilities or special needs who may need help in evacuating if a disaster is poised to strike? If so, you need to find out what that registration is like for clients and get the word out that they need to get on that list now. If they wait until the day before the disaster is supposed to strike, assuming there is some kind of advance notice, it may be too late to get on that registry. Plus, in many states, you never know when the next tornado is going to hit. In Florida, we do have the luxury of somewhat having some kind of an idea of what, of where hurricanes are supposed to hit and about the duration of the disaster, but that's not true everywhere, as you know. So now's the time to start doing that groundwork. Now is also the time to educate clients about what documents they need to secure. There are certain documents that are going to be really important to a lot of clients for a variety of issues that they may not even be able to anticipate. People need to make sure they have copies of their birth certificates, their driver's licenses, their rental agreement if they have it, information about their insurance, their immigration status. These are all important documents that you never know could be very important as a client is trying to navigate a post-disaster situation. They're going to need some of these documents to get new jobs. They may need a document to prove their identity. These are things that are important to have out there for them. And I would say that I know in Florida, a couple of legal services programs have come up with initiatives to help clients electronically store important documents before disasters. And this is something you may want to think about in your own community. Now is also the time to start working with clients who may have potential title issues for home ownership. How can they clear a title? They may not even know they don't have clear title. So this is the time to start talking with clients who own homes about ownership problems. This is very important, especially if they end up having to seek help from FEMA as a homeowner. Title is an ongoing issue that we'll be talking about later, maybe today and definitely tomorrow in this conference. But getting those kinks worked out now will go a long way to help your clients. Again, in Florida, my legal services program has come up with a pilot in several counties where they have partnered pro bono lawyers who do real estate work to work with clients to clear title, and that's been very successful. And it's actually gotten a lot of pro bono lawyers involved who ordinarily wouldn't. I mean, it's in their bailiwick. It's, you know, they know this stuff. They're able to do it quickly, easily, and it's, well, fairly quickly and easily. As you know, some title issues are extremely complicated. But it certainly gives a leg up to clients who otherwise would be completely lost if they waited until after the disaster strikes. So, as you can see, even before the disaster, there's a lot of things that you need to be doing right now. You need to be talking to your local emergency management, your local Red Cross, volunteer organizations, your state agency about what they plan to do with the Disaster SNAP program. Most state agencies have forms and templates in place of how they say they plan to deal with it, but those need to be updated. There's so many different choices that states have when they're implementing a DSNAP program. That's Disaster Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or the old food stamp program. I still call it food stamps. Some of you may not even know what a food stamp is, but it's SNAP now. It's been renamed SNAP. You have a lot of work cut out for you now, even before the disaster strikes. But let's fast forward. And so the worst has happened, and a hurricane has hit your state, or a flood, or a tornado, or lava has covered a community. You know, what do you do? How can you get help? Well, the first few days after a disaster, as you can imagine, folks' main goal is trying to get food, water, and shelter. They're just trying to stay alive. They're not really giving a lot of thought to what their legal needs are at that time. They just want to know that their basic subsistence needs are met. So the first few days after a disaster, that's pretty much what's happening. People are trying to see what's left of their life as they do it before the disaster. But there are many short-term legal problems that will crop up almost immediately after a disaster, maybe not the first couple of days, but soon after. Folks are going to want to make sure that they have emergency shelter if they no longer have a home, if they have food and water, and the legal services that are relevant to those particular needs are what you're going to see in the first few days afterwards. The local shelter, someone tells you, is not ADA compliant. That would be an issue that could come in. The county says that it's not going to let felons in its emergency shelter. That's something that you may see. Some immigrants may be getting turned away improperly from some kind of mass feeding site. These are probably in the first few days, the kind of problems that you'll see. But it does start changing immediately after that. We often see landlord-tenant issues arise quite early after a disaster. The landlord says that I have to keep paying rent even though my apartment is completely unlivable. What am I supposed to do? Is that true? I have to move because my apartment has been destroyed, but I can't get my security deposit back. Is that right? These are things that are going to crop up fairly often. And also, I'm living in HUD housing, but there's no electricity and no one's offered me any kind of alternative. What am I supposed to do? Even people who live in HUD housing and federally assisted housing are also going to be coming to you with tenant issues after a disaster. Clients may come to you because they need to replace important documents that they need to get a job or to apply for public assistance for a whole variety of needs. Now, hopefully, you may have been able to take some time and work on a project to help clients electronically store those documents or to figure out where they're going to keep those documents to keep them safe in a disaster. But if not, you're going to be faced with trying to help clients replace documents that they really need to be able to get on with their lives. After the first few days of eking out food and shelter, clients are going to start asking about what governmental programs are out there to help them. what can help them repair their roof, where can they get some disaster food stamps, they need to eat, they can't feed their family by standing in line at the mass food site for long. There are things that the clients are going to start asking you. They're going to ask you about FEMA assistance and what's available. And now's a good time when they ask that, and actually, hopefully you had this conversation with them before. But folks, when they apply for FEMA, we like to encourage them to make sure they're protecting their interests by doing things like taking photographs of what damage they will be filing a claim for with FEMA. That's very important. As you'll hear in the next couple of days, FEMA will send out an inspector to someone's house who's applied for assistance, who will evaluate the damage to a house, for example. But what we found is that often that evaluation or inspection report falls very short of what the actual damage is that a client has experienced. So it's so important that clients keep records themselves of the damage that has occurred through photographs, through whatever means they can. And when they make repairs, it's important that they keep those receipts. For clients who end up getting FEMA assistance to make repairs, it's not uncommon for FEMA a year or so down the line, or even more, to ask a client for proof that they spent their FEMA benefits in the way they were intended to spend them. If they don't, clients could be facing, a charge of having been overpaid, that funds were used inappropriately, and FEMA may try to recover their funds back from clients. So clients need to keep receipts, they need to keep photographs, they need to keep as many documents safe as they can that might be relevant to them as they continue on with their life after the disaster. Clients are going to want to know what are the deadlines for applying for assistance, and pretty much every program has different deadlines. FEMA assistance has one deadline, disaster unemployment might have another, disaster SNAP has another, depending on where you live in the state. There's all sorts of deadlines, and which also happen to be moving targets, because often these deadlines are extended, which is a very good thing, but you don't know that's going to happen in the beginning, so you have to make sure that people know initially what the deadline is for applying for assistance, and how to apply. Many programs now have electronic application processes like FEMA. Disaster SNAP is one that doesn't do it necessarily electronically, but does require people to go in person unless they can claim an accommodation under the ADA. So that's something to keep in mind. Even for states that run a food stamp program almost 100% electronically, for the DSNAP program, folks normally are required to go in person unless they can prove that they have a disability that prevents them from going. And only then, if FNS has said that they'll make a waiver for that. So look and see how you apply. That's going to be very important. And as I said, for most folks, and in the future, the climate is electronic applications are the way to go for that. But again, if you have a client who is unable to apply electronically, there's always the ADA to fall back on to get an accommodation for folks who cannot participate in the way that the state agency or the federal agency wants you to participate in applying for or qualifying for assistance. Just remember that and keep that in mind. So what is the hierarchy of assistance? Well, as you can imagine, the Red Cross is one of the first responders when it comes to providing assistance to clients. They're going to be the organizations that's there making sure that there's food and water, that people have a roof over their heads to the best that they can assure that. I would also add that in Irma, actually the Department of Agriculture was a big help early on too, because before the disaster food stamp program was implemented, the Department of Agriculture set up a project statewide in affected communities to give out sacks of groceries to folks. So even before grocery stores were open, even before you could use DSNAP, there were ways to get food. There were these grocery handout sites throughout the state. So the Department of Agriculture was very helpful also. There will be mass feeding sites. There'll be, normally I would think there would be shelters that were open depending on the scope of the storm. There could be tents. There could be just your normal shelters at high schools and what other venues your state normally uses for shelters. It just depends. Voluntary organizations like United Way, churches, synagogues, they're important players early on in helping low-income communities respond to and begin to put their lives back together and be safe in the aftermath of a disaster. Insurance. Persons who have insurance are expected to file a claim with their insurance company as the primary source of getting assistance to pay for whatever damage they've incurred. So keep that in mind. If folks have insurance coverage, FEMA, for example, will require that a claim be filed with your insurance company before they'll provide you assistance. And if FEMA ends up providing you assistance that's then later covered by insurance, you're going to have to pay FEMA back. You don't want to get into that trick bag if you can avoid it. The Small Business Administration provides low-interest loans, although a lot of our clients probably aren't going to be able to qualify. They do provide loans for folks because FEMA assistance and all these other forms of assistance may just be inadequate to make up for the damage that a household has experienced. Keep in mind that even though small business has business in the name of it, it's not just for businesses, it's also for persons who would like to apply for a loan, and if they qualify, they can get it. Again, just so you'll know, a lot of people who apply for FEMA assistance will be told by FEMA that they have to apply for an SBA loan, and for some forms of a FEMA assistance, that is absolutely true. For some kind of other needs assistance, you do have to apply for an SBA loan and get denied before you'll be able to be processed for your grant from FEMA. And again, FEMA assistance, FEMA is not going to have a process in place the day after a disaster to be able to take your registration. Well, they may take your registration, but they're not going to be processing it yet. They have to meet with federal and state officials and local officials and do an assessment of the damage. It's usually, it takes a few days to a few weeks, and depending on the political climate, as happened in Florida a few years ago, it took almost a month before a disaster was declared in certain parts of the state because of an ongoing feud between the governor and then President Obama. So that was very disheartening when that happened because that holds up everything. Disaster declaration by the president is kind of the key to getting FEMA involved, disaster unemployment, DSNAP. That's what gets the ball rolling. That disaster declaration, that includes individual assistance. Be wary of hearing that the president has declared, X county a disaster in your state. You need to look and see what that declaration entails. To be able to provide a lot of relief to our clients, it's going to have to include individual assistance. Oftentimes, it will include public assistance, which is great, and provides help to governmental entities on the local level for infrastructure and things like that. But individual assistance is really kind of the meat and potatoes that our clients look for in getting help from the government. Try not to hold this up. And one legal setback can really lead to more. It's like a snowball effect. Take a client who's lost documentation of their identity or their immigration status and has been unable to replace that. They may be unable to get a job or the job they want to get because they don't have those papers showing that information. And that could just lead to so many, which leads to foreclosure. So there's just this ripple effect that what seemingly small legal problem can cause to a family after disaster. And that's what we're going to be talking about now, talking about, midway through and long-term, what other things to be on the lookout for.
Okay. It's time for medium disaster. And as Cindy started off telling you all the things you can do to help with preparedness, I just want to give a quick little story that relates to this. There's two big issues that always show up in a disaster. One is a lot of people, including a lot of the volunteer lawyers, if you haven't been doing this for a long time, you don't understand the interplay between FEMA, the SBA benefits, your insurance, and how they all relate to each other. I tell people it's a dance. And the other issue that shows up a lot, which is going to be one of the medium legal needs, can be the contractor fraud issues with them starting work, doing substandard work, whatever the issue is with regard to that. Texas is a state we often say that, you know, we're debt proof. We have very generous protections against individuals. So it could be very hard to collect against a bad contractor if he's just an individual contractor, if you can even find him. And that's another issue. But one thing I did, my husband and I had a joke about it. Our house flooded. Like at Lone Star, 20 of the people had flooding in their own homes, so we're responding, right? And in the beginning, I did a lot of press. And I used the press, with the press's knowledge and consent, to explain to them who legal aid was, what we did, what disaster legal services was, and also to get out there ahead of time why it was so important for people to register for FEMA and the SBA, because if you miss that window, it's gone. So that was a preventative legal thing I was using press for. And the other thing was to warn about contractor fraud, that, you know, make sure you get references. Don't pay all the payment up front. Don't tell people how much money you got from FEMA or flood insurance. And for God's sake, don't assign your rights. So this was preventative tips addressing medium legal needs. So now I'm just going to go over that a little bit more. But and one thing I also wanted to say, because we're always in this disaster cycle in Texas and Florida, God love us, we're always thinking of the next disaster, and we're always looking for ways to prevent people from, if I can prevent you from having to address a legal need, I've done a good thing, right? And we're all thinking about that all the time. So the medium legal needs. This comes up immediately and midterm. Some of the tenants move out and then want to move home, and if it's dried out, they move home, but the landlord doesn't do the proper mold remediation. So, or it's just too devastated and the landlord doesn't want to release them from the lease. So those are the kind of landlord-tenant questions we have. Clearing title is always an issue. We know in the entire Gulf Coast, clearing title is always an issue because you need to show that you have title. If you don't have the actual title in your name, that you've inherited an heirship portion. In Texas, we talk about heirship or affidavits of heirship. That's going to be an issue. Manufactured housing or RVs, you would be amazed at how few people ever actually transferred the title. The real estate transactions in general, like a contract for deed. These all would be issues that would come up with regard to getting FEMA benefits or with regard to collecting insurance benefits, for example. So heirships and will probates. A lot of people don't realize they have to probate a will, and they've let the 4 years lapse. I'm just talking about Texas law, but there is a way to do it past 4 years under certain circumstances. Mortgage relief, preventing foreclosures. The mortgages, the mortgage companies, if you have one, they'll get your flood insurance or homeowners with you. And then there's the dance and the issue of getting that money back from your mortgage company to actually do the repairs. That's the kind of thing we help with. With regard to the FEMA cases, of course, very quickly, we're doing FEMA appeals. A lot of ours seem to be, the biggest cause is insufficient damage, that they believe the home is habitable for whatever reason. We'll talk about that more in FEMA. And the other one is proving ownership. So those are very common. So we work on those. We get out the release. We request the file. We let FEMA know we're representing someone. And as they point out rightly, FEMA eligibility isn't just for FEMA. The FEMA verified loss will transfer forward when the community development block grant money comes through. And another important point, I said an ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure, that old saying, we do it all the time. When we tell you use your FEMA benefits for what they're for, an example of why it's so important, we tell people this, is if they misspend their FEMA money, and let's say they get $10,000 from FEMA, and then they get approved for the community development block grant, because of duplication benefit, the first thing they're going to have to do is pay in that $10,000. If they haven't actually used it to partially repair their home or they haven't saved it somewhere, they could be precluded from getting their home completely repaired or rebuilt under a community development block grant that they otherwise would be eligible for. So that's why it's so important that lawyers that know this rodeo, know this cycle, are there to help them. So that's why we're training y'all up to be the next batch. So that's what you need to know. And another one, the insurance. So TWIA's the windstorm on the coast, the flood insurance, your automobile, your homeowners. So I tell everyone, Harvey was a wind event in Trolla's area. It was a flood event in Lone Star's area. So we're dealing with different insurance agencies. You need to know what the deadlines are, like flood insurance, because of a flood bulletin, is 1 year from your actual date of damage. And like an important point that we're all training you up to know is it's your damage date. It's not the date of the disaster declaration. And for the regular homeowners insurance, it's 2 years for almost everybody's policy. So they're still going to have time. In Greater Houston, we're looking at a tight deadline to help and advise on that. SBA loans, they interplay with FEMA. It's good to know and understand all that. Identity theft. Apparently, identity theft and fraud was more rampant this disaster than some of the others. And contractor fraud, as I mentioned, it's hard, difficult to do things with an individual. If it's a company that's in business and bonded and insured, it's a whole different animal. Employment, we had disaster unemployment. And we needed to know how that worked. And you might say, well, this is all past. Why are we telling you all this? Because EJW has always generously approved these people for all future disasters during your term. And because this is Florida and Texas, as Tracy will tell you, a new disaster declaration just got made for the Valley. More will come up. So that's why it's so important you know everything about disaster law. And as I said, it's a very broad area of law. Nobody can ever know everything, but we're going to try. So that's the issue. The unemployment, you know, for example, you'd know and advise that first they apply for regular unemployment, and if they don't qualify for that, then they're reprocessed for disaster unemployment, what the deadline is for their appeals, et cetera. Immigration, how it affects the ability to seek financial assistance, human trafficking. Apparently, Greater Houston is a hub for this. So this is an issue. Family law, custody modification. If one spouse with the children moves, doesn't notify the other person, you just gave your spouse, your ex-spouse that you don't like, a ground to actually modify and get custody from you for non-notification. It's important that you address these issues, domestic violence issues. It's one of the few reasons we can split up households with FEMA and get 2 separate households. And once again, snowball effects. And that brings me back to one of my little catchphrases I tell people. I think it was the Pew Charitable Trust. They did an evaluation. People that have one legal need that they present to a legal aid agency for, they really have 7. And it's our job to find them. So if you let someone talk to you for a half an hour on the initial intake, they'll keep mentioning things. And you go, well, what about this? And what about that? So when someone comes with no income, you know, then you find out that the ex-spouse hasn't paid child support in 3 years. And then you found out they were wrongfully discharged from a job. And then you find out. So if you get them to talk about their problems, you'll find out they came to you for 1, but they've really got 7.
Okay, before we actually launch into what these, these long-term needs actually are, I'm going to pause here and get some perspective, because we've already given you all a lot of information. And y'all may have heard with actual volunteers, people who see an event on the news, they want to get involved, they want to help however they can, then the news moves on to something else. And we're going to be some of those people. We're not volunteers, we're getting paid to do this, but we're going to jump in and be doing a lot in that short term. It's intense. There's just so many needs, and you are working with clients who are hurting so much. And then those midterm needs are still going to be there. and they're going on for a long time. And then you have these long-term needs we're going to talk about. You have to consider that you may also be affected by that volunteer fatigue. You have to figure out how you're going to work hard but still pace yourself, because your clients and then more clients are going to need you for a long time to come. So you got to kind of figure that out. Know your supports within your organization. Talk to people in your organization who've been doing this kind of thing a while, so that you figure out how to not burn yourself out in that earlier set of legal needs. With that in mind, it's important to try to expand our capacity where we can. So know who may help you meet your clients' needs. Now, there's the legal community and the non-legal community you need to look to here. We have a number of attorneys. In Texas, there were something like 2,000 attorneys that volunteered to do pro bono work after the disaster. We experienced some volunteer fatigue as we start trying to work through that, but we ended up with an amazing FEMA appeals network of pro bono attorneys across the nation, with the Association of Pro Bono Counsel and a number of law firms I'm not even going to try to name because there were so many that were so good, but they're continuing to work not only on FEMA appeals that arose out of Hurricane Harvey, but they were working on some for American Samoa and Hawaii, and there's disasters all the time somewhere in the United States. We all end up working on these things when it hits in our backyard, and to some extent, because of our funding, we have to operate with those geographic constraints, but this work continues somewhere all the time. And so I think, well, Katrina was this really important moment where advocates across the nation connected and began to figure out a lot of things and share notes. Harvey, Irma, and Maria all together, and then the California wildfires helped everybody kind of mobilize. We have a new momentum. And so I'm hoping that this will become institutional knowledge at all kinds of places, but we'll keep our pro bono volunteers mobilized to keep working on these things. And the FEMA appeals is just an example, but title clearing is another example that can be happening all the time. And then the non-legal networks, we have to think about what is our client's goal. So we use legal ideas to try to assist them, but if you're connected with your long-term recovery group in the community and they're able to give your client a home, that may meet their need. You can think about doing the FEMA appeal and work on that, but also know your network so you can connect them to other opportunities so that your client may meet their goal. It doesn't have to be a legal solution all of the time. Just keep that in the mix. And then understand, Cindy was talking about preparation and how important that is. But we've got disaster work all the time. It's a cycle. It's never over. And I think that's a misconception both in the non-legal and legal communities. Aren't y'all done with that yet? Harvey was a long time ago. But you have that immediate response. Probably when we're doing the short-term stuff, you have a long recovery effort. For Harvey, they were estimating it's going to be a 10-year process, and Maddie can tell you more about that. But preparation is informed by whatever you're recovering and responding to. You have to think about not all disasters are alike. You don't want to be limited by what just happened, but it absolutely informs your preparation for next time. And then there's mitigation efforts. So there's a cycle. I just couldn't do the graphic for a cycle, but you get it. Now, as far as what do we see long-term, some of the legal needs that arise in these earlier stages are going to spike later also. We're going to be dealing with title clearing as we're working on FEMA appeals and some of that stuff early on, but as there's more of the CDBG disaster recovery money in housing programs in our communities, people are not going to be getting repair or replacement assistance that's really significant if they can't show title. And so, Maddie's going to be doing some of that upfront work, looking at what are the standards going to be so that they aren't going to create unnecessary obstacles for our clients. But sometimes, you can't get around it. Somebody's going to have to show some ownership interest. They can't give money to somebody who doesn't own the home and sink a lot of money into that. So we've got to do that title clearing work. Landlord-tenant issues, you're going to have that go on for a very long time, and it's kind of that whole snowball effect. If you have a problem getting additional rental assistance from FEMA and you aren't able to pay your rent, now you're dealing with an eviction. Or if you've been robbing Peter to pay Paul to make makeshift repairs, you may not be paying the mortgage. So you're going to have more foreclosures at this stage as people are just falling further and further behind financially. More debt collection actions in general could end up in bankruptcy. And then FEMA recoupment. Saundra and Cindy, I think, both mentioned this, but FEMA there's a balance where they're trying to push money out to people who need the help sooner rather than later. We all deal with obstacles that frustrate us as we're trying to get people FEMA assistance, but in some situations it goes out too fast. Oops, we gave them a $2,000 check and we put $2,000 in their bank account. And they go back and check later and somebody wasn't eligible. Well, your clients need to understand they could get letters from FEMA saying, sorry, you were overpaid, get, in my opinion, a rather cryptic notice of what the issue is. You can appeal this decision, or you need to start repaying in 30 days, or we're going to tack on penalties and administrative fees. And if this becomes final, if your client doesn't deal with it somehow, it's going to go to the U.S. Treasury as a final debt, and they're going to have all kinds of options to collect. They can get your wages, they can do administrative offsets if you have more than a certain amount of Social Security benefits, and they can take tax returns. So it's important that our clients don't bury their heads in the sand. So understand for Harvey, for Irma, for Maria, we're going to be seeing these. I think Saundra said she's actually seen 1 or 2 already. So they're coming, and several of us have dealt with them after prior disasters. The procedures have changed some over the years. There was some litigation on the process, but it's still pretty problematic. Understand too that, oh, I didn't move forward. That you can ask FEMA to compromise the debts also, and in some situations, for instance, if you have a client whose only income is SSI and it's less than $700 a month, and they don't have assets that are going to allow FEMA to collect, you want to put all the right documents together, do it timely, and show FEMA you're not going to be able to collect from this person. Please just stop these efforts. And it takes a long time, but we've been successful with those. So there are things we can try to do about this. Okay, and then, so I work at Texas RioGrande Legal Aid. We work with individual clients and do direct services, but that informs impact work. That informs our ability to look for ways to change something with systems. So you need to, as you're working on these cases, we'll work on a high volume of them. Are we seeing a larger problem? Are we seeing trends? Why are there so many insufficient damage denials in the FEMA cases that we're working on in certain counties, or for our disasters in Texas versus what happened somewhere else? Are you seeing obstacles to people getting assistance? And you want to brainstorm about how to seek a systemic fix. I mean, you do what you need to do for your individual clients, but if you're seeing, so after Hurricane Katrina, we worked on several thousand FEMA matters. After Hurricane Dolly hit the Rio Grande Valley, affected 3 counties in South Texas that are close to the Texas-Mexico border, we worked on a few hundred cases. We saw a lot of insufficient damage denials, and even though it's not in the FEMA paperwork, we were being told there's deferred maintenance. These people don't keep their homes up. There's substandard conditions in the home, so we're not going to give them anything. We're thinking, what can we do to address that on a larger level? Because we are not going to help everybody who's getting denied for that reason, individually. So, and I put here because a lot of us work for LSC-funded organizations. I don't know about the funding for some of the other groups, but you got to know what your limits are. More on the next slide about that. But are you able to contact somebody with a particular program and say, I don't understand why this is happening, can you explain it to me? Maybe it can be resolved like that, or you talk to their attorney. LSC organizations were able to utilize public comment opportunities. You can't just go contact a government representative out of the blue and do this, but if there's public comment invited, or if you're invited to, you generally can. Talk to y'all supervisors, make sure you understand your limits. But you can do administrative complaints. There are times that shining a light on a situation with the media, a press release or press conference, that may help you get an issue addressed. Or litigation. Recent example, Hurricane Maria, you've got advocates who filed a lawsuit against FEMA and were able to obtain an injunction to prevent people's whose hotel assistance was to end on June 30th. They were able to, say freeze, these people get to stay in the hotel while we figure this out, and that's still in the works, but that's very recent. But that litigation made the difference because pleas to FEMA to extend the program and so on weren't getting the job done. Okay, so because I work for an LSC-funded organization, you must be mindful. You have to know which tools are in your toolbox and which are not. So we can't lobby. And you gotta, and I have it in quotes because you gotta understand what the definition is in the regs and how it's interpreted and consult with the people that you work for. And we can't do class actions. So these are just examples of the kinds of things. This is not an exhaustive list. There's other prohibitions and that, but you have to understand that. So also, you guys are all part of this EJW program. You need to understand what limitations apply to you as part of this program. So consult with your supervisors. But I don't want that to be discouraging. Be flexible, be creative, know what the rules are, play within those rules, but there are still a lot of tools in our toolboxes. There's a lot we can do. I think that is, I'm going to explain this briefly and then I'm going to pass it on to Maddie. So understand, and this was, Karen was saying this in the beginning, our client populations are particularly vulnerable, and it's going to be a more difficult recovery. There's lots of different kinds of disasters, but for instance, flooding, there's an expert at Texas A&M University, I think it's Shannon Van Zandt, but I had testified at a hearing about lower income individuals live in lower quality housing in lower lying areas. So as you see some of these issues that arise out of a flooding event, there's going to be more people in that population that are going to struggle with these issues. And then there's an increased emphasis at the federal level on this being a federally supported but state-managed and locally executed disaster recovery model. More of the costs are shifting down, and ultimately the costs get shifted down to individuals. And there's a big push with FEMA now in a larger plan. Why aren't people getting insurance? And that is important, absolutely. We want to recommend to clients early on, whatever insurance you can afford, you want to do that. You're going to be best protected if you do that. But a lot of our clients are making very, very tough choices about how to spend the limited income and resources that they have. So if they don't have that, what are their options? We're going to see more and more people hurting with the way some of this stuff is moving. And I'm going to turn it over to Maddie at this point.
So compounding the fact that our clients and the people we care about are more vulnerable to disasters and have a harder time recovering, the system is really not set up for them. The National Disaster Framework basically assumes, FEMA benefits are supposed to last for 18 months, generally extended, that, hey, you might need 18 months of temporary housing assistance, but by then you will have gotten, your insurance and your SBA loan and your house will be ready to move back in. So for our clients who can't access, don't have those other resources, can't access those other resources, they're getting nothing. Maybe some temporary housing assistance from FEMA, but they're not moving forward on recovery in a lot of ways during that time period. And really the only money for long-term housing recovery is community development block grants for disaster recovery, CDBG-DR. One of the things you will learn is that disaster recovery is really acronym heavy. So I will try not to use too many of them, but CDBG-DR is really much faster to say. So, and those allocations, that money hasn't hit yet. The best case scenario is that states are going to start spending that money maybe this fall. So we're looking at over a year with, for low and moderate income people, really no access to disaster recovery, no way to rebuild. There's just, the system is just not set up for them. It's, also, Saundra's mentioned, it's really impenetrable. FEMA basically uses thanks to Tracy and Trella, they are not supposed to be using this deferred maintenance standard. They're still doing it. And the other way in which this is not set up for our clients is FEMA data really undercounts them and their need. And then that FEMA data is used to allocate CDBG-DR. So it does this in a couple of ways. One is that the FEMA verified loss amounts, FEMA comes in and says, we think you lost this much. So if your house is not worth that much, or the FEMA inspector doesn't think it's worth that much, you're going to end up with a much lower FEMA verified loss amount. And mostly, planning is looking at, well, where was the really severe damage? Well, there's a much higher just monetary amount for a $300,000 house than there is for a $20,000 house. So those needs of low and moderate income people are getting really undercounted. FEMA also really, the data on renters is terrible. They're not counting rental units lost. They're looking at the personal property of renters. And once again, the sort of major-ish level of damage is $2,000. So if your client's personal property or what they lost wasn't worth $2,000, or the FEMA inspector doesn't think it was, they're not being counted as having this kind of unmet need. So the data is really an issue. It's something I think we've all worked on. It's something we're pushing really hard on this disaster to get the states and locals to use better needs assessments. So far, not really happening. What's happening right now, and you'll hear more than you ever wanted to about CDBGR this afternoon, but we are in the states have to produce action plans for how they are going to use this money. HUD's approved Texas's already, but there's now a process. Texas is a real fetish for local control. So there are multiple levels of sub-allocation that is sort of an ongoing process. But then there will be also program design and implementation. And those are really important places to get input and to push your clients' interests. I would say overall, if you can, within your constraints, build relationships with the local and state agencies that are doing this stuff, it's much easier to get them to put something in the guidelines up front than it is to get it changed afterwards. There's been a lot of success in the state with using fair housing complaints and other complaints to change programs and policies and how money is distributed. That landscape is really different. We are not expecting federal enforcement, just to put it bluntly. And there are, I think in both states, some real political constraints on what states can do or can be seen to be doing. Yet another reason to think about what's the best strategy for getting something, for getting things for your client, for getting rules to benefit them. Sort of my organization's philosophy, and really mine, has been get it up front if you can, enforce if you need to. And just sort of a quick overview of, I think, the major issues that have popped up that really affect our clients. One is public and affordable housing and getting it rebuilt. Communities in Texas have seen this as a great opportunity to do a little cleansing of public housing residents and people of color. I am still working on Hurricane Ike from 2008, and that's what's left, was racially motivated opposition to public housing that has prevented it from being rebuilt. So you're gonna have NIMBY issues and public opposition to that. You also have issues around what affordability level is being rebuilt. The CDBG regs require only 51% of the rebuilt housing to be affordable to people at 80% of area median income or less. 80% of area median income, is middle class, right? It's not low income. Not to say those people don't need affordable housing, but if we are concerned with people, a lot of our clients are 30% or under. So there's real potential, and I think it's happened, for CDBG-funded affordable housing to replace more affordable housing with less affordable housing. So pushing really hard on trying to get states and communities to require, or at least incentivize, more 30% units. It's one of the reasons rebuilding public housing is really important, because those are affordable units. Infrastructure and economic development. An issue, again, for our clients is that they live in historically disinvested communities. Their infrastructure was probably not up to standard before the storm. And the history of CDBG is that communities like to spend a little bit of housing money on poor people, but they like to do big citywide infrastructure projects or rebuilding parks in high-income areas. I mean, there's a real You know, the political pressure is to use the infrastructure money, that's the candy money, to use it to benefit people with more political power. So ensuring, you know, not only that housing is being rebuilt and that housing is being rebuilt in safer areas, but that, you know, our communities are getting their fair share of infrastructure funds. And by their fair share, I mean, you know, not geographically equal, not, you know, numerically equal, but enough to bring them up to standard and mitigate. You know, that is a huge issue. I've talked a little about income targeting. You know, one of the other equity issues in housing is, and it's going to be much bigger this time around, is mobility. Are people able to move to safer areas? So Texas in 2008 did, I think it's the first in the country, homeowner mobility program where people could choose to rebuild in place or they could choose to move somewhere safer. State does not appear to be doing that this time around, also something we're pushing on, but we're doing a lot of buyouts. So, you know, and the sort of FEMA formula is, you know, 75% of pre-storm value. Once again, low-income people, people of color, have lower value homes for systemic reasons. So if they're, you know, if you're getting 75% of the value of your $35,000 house, you are not getting enough money to move. So one of the things we, speak very broadly, are pushing and that we are actually seeing in Harris County's draft housing guidelines is adding other money, you know, incentives and additional benefits that mean low and moderate income families are going to have enough money to move somewhere safer. And I think the mobility issue is going to be a big one, particularly for individual clients. You know, people have some different interests around this. Some people are going to be like, great, move me somewhere safer, I want to do this. But, you know, also there are clients who are very attached to their neighborhoods, who have deep roots there, who are not going to want to move. And I think that's going to be an important thing to sort of help people think through and get counseling about, because this is not going to get better, right? As Tracy said, this is going to get worse. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. And certainly, you know, to a great extent, our, you know, again, our clients live in geographically vulnerable areas. So talking to them about, you know, you're going to flood again. And requirements like, if you get help, you're supposed to maintain flood insurance in perpetuity. You know, can you afford that if you live in a floodplain? And really, we need to be thinking about solutions beyond just recovering from this disaster and beyond just sort of recovery and rebuilding in general. We need to think about, you know, mitigation. You know, are our neighborhoods and our clients being protected or offered an opportunity to move? You know, climate gentrification. You know, this is already an issue in Miami where, you know, low-income neighborhoods were forced, you know, off the nice beach, but now those neighborhoods didn't flood and the beachfront ones did, and people are moving in and raising housing prices. I mean, housing prices are going up in Houston. So thinking about how, you know, this money can be used to preserve affordable housing and prevent displacement, as well as move, you know, help move geographically vulnerable communities is really important. And this work ties into everything else your programs do. And so thinking about, you know, environmental justice issues, which are also big in disaster, community development, fair housing, you know, all of this is really tied together. And then, you know, it's really important for all of us to think about this as a really global set of issues. You know, not only because there's disaster after disaster, but because, you know, these are the problems of our communities and frankly, all of our communities.
This is good. We should probably develop a glossary of all of the different acronyms. Okay, but no questions for now? Okay, on to the success stories.
Okay, one big one that helped nationwide, we've done FEMA appeals, and we told you this, ownership's always a problem, right? And we do affidavits of heirship, and then they get accepted, and they say our clients are the owner. But this year, they were telling us they were gonna deny us before they denied us, which gave me the opportunity to call Mary Ellen Martinet at the OCC and say, what's going on? And she arranged for me to explain this to the head of the individual and household program. And he heard this, and his big point was, and you've always won these before. Yes, but then my problem was all the people that didn't get to us that got denied, right? And he heard that, and he heard, and they've been the owners all along. Yes, because that's how Texas law works. He goes, oh, that's a disservice. We're adding Texas affidavits of heirship to the list of accepted ownership documents. And I said, and that's wonderful, and this is a problem all across the Gulf Coast. The other states will be calling you. So that was one that helped a lot of people. And another one that had a big impact is an evil condo association was stealing everybody's flood insurance because they have the master policy. And they were telling the people, look, and they were just showing them the remediation thing, and it was a couple $1,000s, but the repairs were about 30. And somebody held up one of our clients at gunpoint in the dark in their parking lot and said, stop asking about the insurance. So we had 8 or 9 of these clients, and because of the threat, we decided to do one demand letter and floated up the balloon of the client that said, I don't care, use my name, go. And so we sent up the demand letter, and then all of a sudden they started calling everyone in to give them $25,000 and $30,000 and asking them to sign the release. And we told them there's more money on the table, but our clients were happy with that. So, and that's a big success story. We think they got about $80,000 because of the one demand letter.
A quick one from Florida in Irma. I think you may have heard, because it was such a widespread disaster that affected so many counties in the state. We had a huge need for disaster supplemental nutrition assistance program benefits, DSNAP. I call them, disaster food stamps. The way the disaster food stamp program has always worked is FNS requires that applicants for the program, FNS, Food and Nutrition Service of the Department of Agriculture, requires that applicants for the program go in person to a site where they will be interviewed. And that's so important to FNS because they say that this will cut down on fraud. Now, forget that millions of people apply every day for regular food stamps without having to go in person in Florida. It's just, millions don't apply every day, but millions have applied electronically and never had to go in person. And that's the way Florida has structured their food stamp program. They do not want people to come in person. They're not equipped to see people in person. But FNS wants everyone for the disaster food stamp program to come and be looked at face-to-face by a worker. They say to prevent fraud, which we can understand their concern. But there are some people who, because of disabilities, are physically unable to travel to a site to be interviewed or to stand in line for up to, I don't know, 7 hours a day. I don't know if you saw, but in Florida, the lines to apply for the program were up to 50,000 people long. And so it was a complete disaster. The police, the local, police communities shut down the Food for Florida sites because it was just unwieldy. There were too many people. People were having to go to the hospital because this was in the middle of the, it was like 90-something degrees outside. It was really bad. And yet they held on to that. You have got to come into person. We can't let you out of this. There was no accommodation to that. The accommodation was something that's already built into the program, which is you can have someone else apply for you. That person, of course, has to assume the liability if there's some kind of problem, and you have to reveal everything personal about yourself to this person who goes in, if you can even find someone who might do it for you, and people couldn't. So I'm in a program that is not restricted, and so we were able to, with other organizations, University of Miami Health Clinic and the Community Justice Project in Miami, we were able to file a lawsuit to challenge the fact that there were no accommodations for the DSNAP program. The judge made it very clear during the first injunction hearing that she was inclined to rule for us and urged FNS to reconsider its position, which it did. And for the first time ever in the history of disaster SNAP program or a disaster food stamp program, FNS allowed a state to waive in-person interviews and allow the interview to be done over the phone. So this has been a problem ongoing in other states for a long time, and we're hoping that this is going to serve as a model now, which will be a catalyst to finally let that happen in other states. Thousands of people were able to get disaster SNAP because of that, and we were very happy. And so that's our one big success that we're still celebrating.
So TRLA has filed lawsuits against FEMA 4 different times over the years, but I'm going to talk about one from 2008 that we just resolved earlier this year. So we spent a good 9 years in this legal battle. After Hurricane Dolly hit the Rio Grande Valley, 3 counties were part of that declaration, all along that Texas-Mexico border, and there was a really high rate of denials for insufficient damage. We always see high rates, but really high there. And a FEMA spokesperson said that it was because of the deferred maintenance in homes. Our big concern with FEMA is we want transparency and consistency. They get to, there's statutes and regs and then policies, but we don't know exactly what they are. The published materials didn't describe what they meant by deferred maintenance and how inspectors would actually make that decision. So it took a lot of litigating Administrative Procedure Act and Stafford Act claims over the 9-year period. We did a lot of discovery and ultimately learned that inspectors had been instructed that if they believed the home had deferred maintenance, a particular component of the home, they were only to consider it disaster related if the disaster had significantly worsened that, obviously and without question. Pretty high standard. And FEMA can do that. We just said it must be published under the Administrative Procedure Act and the Stafford Act. And a federal judge agreed with us, and the remedy in these cases is that those FEMA decisions have to be reconsidered by FEMA. It gets remanded to the agency. Well, we were representing like 25 different families as well as an organization, Lupe, in the Valley, and so the judge ordered that that remedy was going to apply to our 25 families or those households that had applied for FEMA and been denied with that particular reason, as well as Lupe members who established they had the same kind of denial for Dolly. We ended up handing out, we worked out a settlement and handed out over $500,000 to 50 or so different families who'd been impacted by that, and learned a lot as we head into a new case we filed in 2016 for similar issues.
So in 2009, we filed a fair housing complaint against the state of Texas with HUD over how the state was proposing to distribute $1.7 billion in CDBG-DR for Ike and Dolly. There were a lot of issues with the action plan. We negotiated a conciliation agreement with the state thanks to some significant federal leverage, which I don't think I'll see in my life again. And that settlement moved $250 million back to the Gulf Coast, over, I think, $250 million into housing, increased the amount of money that had to benefit LMI people from 50 to 55%, guaranteed the rebuilding of public housing, which we are still fighting over. So that's a success story, but what I really think was successful about it is when I look at the action plan and even the Federal Register notices for this disaster, we can see some of this work reflected in them. One of our long-term fights with the state was whether fair housing and civil rights requirements applied to infrastructure money as well as housing money. State's action plan is very clear. You have to justify your infrastructure allocations on, fair housing grounds. And state is so far not fighting the 70% LMI requirement, although there's quite a push to do it. Is doing more affordable housing up front and prioritizing housing recovery in a way it hasn't done it. So I think the landscape is different, but I also think, so the landscape for enforcement is different, but I also think the landscape we're starting from is different, and those hooks are in the state plan, and we can go back to them.
Just so you know, as a teaser to the after lunch session, She would deny this, but the person who is largely responsible for that extraordinary success story, and which will be, there's a similar story out of Mississippi that our lunch speaker may tell, is the former Assistant Secretary at HUD, Mercedes Marquez, who will be joining the panel after lunch. And I can just tell you, that is like that's like candy. I mean, like the best favorite candy you've ever had. She is an extraordinary person and one of the most strategic people I know. And she was in leadership to pull that off years after the disaster, when most people thought, well, the feds can't do anything because it's been too much time has passed. And she did it anyway. So you'll all get to hear from her as well. And I would echo the point that Maddie made that, you know, back in Katrina, we didn't have the benefit of this extraordinary wealth of experience. So I want to again thank our panelists who have all agreed to be on other panels so that we really get to soak it out of them. So thank you again.